Welcome, and thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, Unpacking Latest Trends and Patterns in Global Military Expenditure. This webinar is organized by the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, together with the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and the Defense and Security Program of Transparency International. My name is Alexandra Kuimova. I'm a researcher working with the Conventional Arms and Ammunition Program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, and I have a privilege to moderate this interesting and important discussion today. Our webinar will provide an opportunity to discuss key global, regional, and national military expenditure trends and patterns in light of the rapidly deteriorating security environment. It will unpack the main factors driving challenges in military spending levels and examine some of the widespread consequences of military expenditure. We'll also discuss the topic of transparency, accountability, and oversight, with particular attention to the risks associated with the lack of transparency in defense budgets, namely corruption risks. I would like to encourage you all to participate in our conversation by asking questions to the panelists. You can share your question in the Q&A window that you can see on your screen. And we will try to address some of the questions, if not all of them, during the Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. Now, let me introduce a fantastic panel of speakers we have lined up for you today. We are very fortunate to welcome Dr. Diego Lopez da Silva, Senior Researcher with the Military Expenditure and Arms Production Program at SIPRI. Diego's current research concerns the interplay between institutions, political transitions, and military spending. Diego will walk us through military spending trends and patterns today. I'm also pleased to welcome Ara Marcin Nawal, Head of Advocacy with Defense and Security Program in Transparency International, who works towards raising awareness of the nexus of corruption, conflict, and insecurity. With that, I would like to turn the floor to Diego. Diego, first of all, my warmest congratulations to the SIPRI team on publishing the report on trends in world military expenditure. I know how hard SIPRI works on collecting and analyzing data on global military spending, and I'm myself honored to be able to discuss new data fresh from the oven with you and Ara today. So Diego, I have read the report. World military expenditure increased for the 9th consecutive year in 2023. So could you please tell us more about trends and patterns in global military spending? What were the main factors driving changes in military spending levels? And what were the main data highlights? So the screen is yours, Diego, and thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you so much. No, I'll gladly try to answer all those questions. Thank you very much for the invitation and just the opportunity to present our work, as you said, fresh out of the oven, and also to be part of the panel with Ara, which I think we're going to have a really interesting conversation about how increases and the necessity of having oversight of those increases is also very, very important. So yeah, thank you very much for the invitation. So as Alexandra said, what I'm trying to do is that I'm going to try to give some overview over the trends. But because there are many numbers and they're hard to keep track of them all, I'm going to try to do this through some visuals. Then I suppose the trends can be clearer. And I'll be happy to engage with you all with your questions after the presentation. I am going to share my screen with you so we can have a look at the figures. So please do let me know. No, I haven't shared. I suppose now you can see my screen, correct? Okay. All right, so maybe we can start with this figure, which is the first figure we have in our publication, the fact sheet on the trends of global military expenditure 2023. And that's the opening that we have. And this figure, it's simple, but it says a lot. Here in this trend, this is world military expenditure from 1998 to 2023, and basically shows a very clear contrast. I suppose that's one of the first things we can see. If we look at 2023, we can see that there is really a spike in an upward trend that really picks up around 2020 and then continues to 2021 and continues to increase. Of course, the 2022 and 2023, that's a bit steeper. But we can see that this is kind of a part of, that's the intensification of a trend, right? That really shoots up. We can see that there are two different periods here. We can see a period where military spending went down in the 1990s, and that's the period that we call the peace dividends. Of course, that's very localized. That's really North America and Europe, where we can talk about those peace dividends. But we can see that there is really a belly, like a drop there. That's a period where we had this idea of cooperation, of the liberal world order, and faith in international institutions. And that is really a contrast with the period we're having now, where threat perceptions and really security conditions around the world are really eroding in a way. And I guess the numbers are really showing that clear contrast between two different periods. This is not to say that we're back to a Cold War period. These are very distinct moments. We're not having a clear ideological clash between two blocks. That's not the case. But the idea of conflict, especially now of conventional conflicts, it's really on the minds of many decision makers around the world, and that's really driving military spending upwards. Right now, 2023, we are at $2.4 trillion. That's 2.3% of the world GDP. But don't get fooled by just the 2.3% of world GDP, because there's wide variation there. We have some countries that spend as little as 1% or less than that of their GDP in their militaries, but we also have countries that spend 9%, or even Ukraine now, for obvious reasons, spending 37% of its GDP in its military. So there's wide variation there. Now, if we zoom in, of course, here we have different colors for each region. If we zoom in to have a look at the countries, and in 2023 only, we can see that military spending is very much concentrated, not only regionally, but also in a very small group of countries. We can see, of course, the United States, that in 2023 spent 37% of the world's total military expenditure was just the US. Of course, we also have China, which is the second largest spender with 12%. And we can also see the other big spenders, such as Russia, India, the United Kingdom, and also Saudi Arabia. But we also can see Ukraine now here. And Ukraine now is at, if we round, it's 65 billion, it's 64.8 billion. But that's really an interesting case, because now it's the 8th largest spender in the world. And if you take back a few years, that's much lower than that. So it's now up in the ranks of the top 10 largest spenders, of course, again, for obvious reasons. But here in this figure, I just wanted to highlight how concentrated military spending really is in the few countries. But one thing that is important to say here is that this is level of military spending, right? We're not at the moment talking about how they allocate the money compared to other areas of expenditure, so to speak. So other measures that we provide that would be interesting to investigate that issue would be, again, military spending as a share of GDP, but also in our database, you can find data for military spending per capita, and also military spending as a share of government expenditure. So you want to have a look at really at preferences and prioritizing certain areas of government expenditure. I suppose those other measures are also very interesting to have a look at. In this figure, I wanted to really illustrate that point that of rising tensions and the number of conflicts. According to the Uppsala conflict program and the data that they collect, we have more than 40 ongoing armed conflicts in the world. Of course, kind of Ukraine, because of the attention it gets, kind of looms large and sometimes overshadows those other conflicts. But this kind of illustrates of all the other hotspots that we have around the world that are also driving military spending upwards, right? So just to explain what we have here, the darkest colors are the highest increases in 2023. So we can have, of course, in the DRC, we had 105% increase in military spending. That's the highest relative change that we had. But of course, we had all the other ones that were quite high, as you can see, for the darkest colors. And The red hotspots are they illustrate the number of violent events that took place in 2023 according to the OCLED database, right? And what we can see here is that there are many hotspots around the world. We have the Sahel, we have Sudan, we have Myanmar. In the Middle East, we have Gaza, of course, but also Syria. And the biggest hotspot is Ukraine. And you can see that those increases and the hotspots are kind of correlated. You can see that in Europe, of course, you have that big hotspot, but also like the blue all around indicating the increases. So this is really to show the multiple drivers, at least related to conflict, that we have around the world, really driving military spending up. So it's not something, we talk a lot about the war in Ukraine, in Europe, but it's not something just in Europe. Here, I want to explore more this idea of military spending as shared GDP and give you kind of an outlook of the past 5 years. So these bars, they show the percentage point increase or decrease variation in military spending as a share of GDP. So basically, if the bar is really high, then and to the right, it's showing that countries are allocating more as a share of GDP compared to the previous year. Here it's 2019. We have somewhat equal distribution. Of course, more countries increasing their military burdens, but then the COVID-19 hits, the pandemic hits in 2020. And what happened was that because public expenditure has sort of inertia and you have an economic slowdown, of course, because of the pandemic, what happened was that military spending continued to rise. Economic growth was negative or very small. What happened was that military spending as share GDP really grew. So we have more countries on the right, really showing that in that year, more countries allocated more resources to the military. In 2021, as we had the beginning of a recovery at the same time with some adaptation in public expenditures, some decreases in military spending, we had the opposite, kind of shifted towards the left, tilted to the left, where military burden decreased. Then, of course, the war in Ukraine took place. And then you see up there in the first bar, kind of the percentage point increase for Ukraine really made everything in scale kind of shrink because it was such a huge increase because of the war. And then in 2023, we had the same picture, but also other countries doing kind of the same. But this is only to show just the huge impact that the war had, of course, in Ukraine's military spending as a share of GDP that now is at 37%, the highest in the world. Now talking about the war in Ukraine and European countries, something that has been discussed a lot is the guideline among NATO countries to spend 2% of GDP. So in this graph, basically, the more red the cell is, the higher the military burden is for NATO allies. I'm not showing yet the ones above 2%, but you can see that 2023 is a bit more red than the other countries. So countries are spending more, but not all of them are really reaching the 2%. If we filter this to only above 2%, we can see that only 11 countries out of the 31 countries in the Allies in 2023, they spent more than 2%. So it's only about a third yet. This certainly will change because since the war, these countries have made pledges to increase their military spending, some stretching up until 2030. They all have made pledges to be above. So 2% is not anymore, at least among NATO allies, the understanding is not that it's anymore the ceiling, but it's really not a ceiling, but like a target, but a minimum, right? So the idea is that at least 2% and not necessarily to be at 2%. So this kind of shows that it's still 11. This will likely change. And again, just to give you an overall idea of NATO again, this is world military expenditure, but split between NATO and non-NATO. And you can see that it's quite a lot that just the military might or concentration military spending among NATO countries. That's 55% of the world's military expenditure is being carried out by NATO countries. And again, about the war in Ukraine, just to talk about a little bit about scale, right? And that's my final slide. And then we can begin with the conversations and after, of course, Ada's presentation. So this is a decade of the war, versus war against Ukraine, annexation 2014, and now full-scale invasion. And here, this is Ukraine's military spending and Russia's military spending. This is not stacked, this is overlaid. So it's just to give you an idea of how big they are compared to one another. In 2023, Ukraine spent about 60% of Russia's military spending, the equivalent, right? Which is quite remarkable if you compare just the size of the two countries that it managed to get there. But to reach that 60%, it had to spend 37% of its GDP, right? Which makes you think, of course, of how far the economy can really go and sustain that burden of 37%, especially if you're talking about an invasion, which of course means losing territory, and with that losing revenue from tax. So which makes Ukraine very reliant on external aid. If we sum and we add external aid to that war effort, according to our methodology, we always include military aid into the donors calculations. But here, just so we can understand, let's say, this comparison, if we add military aid to Ukraine here, you can see that it kind of moves up and it reaches 90% of Russia's military spending. 1 point, military spending and military capability, different things. Military capability needs a lot of qualitative aspects as well that, but military spending is one of the inputs. So here we have it 90%. So still with all that effort, we're still at 90%. So this also, of course, raises questions about fatigue and, of course, just the discussions that we've been observing in the US, the difficulties to approve the package to Ukraine. And so considering the need and just the reliance that Ukraine has on that aid, as we can see here, it's quite, there's a lot of doubt, especially with the US elections coming. So I guess this kind of shows the overall, let's say, war effort. I'm going to stop here. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your questions. This is my email if you have any questions, at diego.lopez@sipri.org. Yeah, so thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Diego. As always, very insightful presentation. Thank you for walking us through the trends, and thank you for discussing with us the latest trends in military spending and also explaining what was behind those increases. It was very, very interesting to see your presentation and to listen to. But before we continue, I would like to remind our attendees that you can share your questions in the Q&A window that you can see on your screen, and we will try to address these questions during the Q&A session towards the end of the webinar. We could see from the data that many states have already increased military budget, and if you mentioned as well, Diego, other states also announced that there will be increases in the defense budget in the coming years. You also mentioned that global military burden remained quite high, once again showing that some states, some not all, of course, tend to prioritize investments in their militaries. And well, as more resources are being allocated to military activities, of course, the question of transparency, accountability, oversight in defense budgeting processes becomes more crucial than ever. So what risks and threats are associated with increased military spending? What should we pay attention to when we further analyzing such developments and data? What should states, civil society organizations, experts be cautious about? And for this, Ara, I would like to give the floor to you to shed the light on some of the implications of rising militarization and rising levels of military spending And of course, I would also like to congratulate you and Transparency International with publishing the report yesterday, Trojan Horse Tactics, Unmasking the Imperative for Transparency in Military Spending, that provides an overview of the nexus between corruption and increased defense spending. So once again, congratulations. But now, please, the screen is yours. We look forward to seeing your presentation. Thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you, Alexandra. And thank you to Unity for organizing this webinar today, and to SIPRI, not only for this webinar, but the unwavering dedication in compiling military expenditure data year after year. This is a fundamental tool for many of us in civil society organizations. First, you will know Transparency International as the movement working on anti-corruption. I work in the Defense and Security Program of Transparency International, and we focus on anti-corruption issues and governance with that sectoral lens, aiming to build integrity and transparency in the defense and security sectors. And as Diego highlighted, the increased global insecurity, all those, that mapping with all those areas of conflict and hot areas, has propelled that very sharp rise in militarization and defense spending. And what we heard with the data is that alarming figure of 6.8 increase in real terms. So this trend demands our attention and prompted us last year to highlight the imperative for transparency in military spending through that paper that you mentioned, Alexander, the Trojan Horse Tactics. And with this title, I often feel that I find myself in the role of Cassandra, sounding the alarm of that underestimated fall in times of rising military crisis and military expenditure, that is corruption. Corruption can take many shapes. It can be bribery, and I think that's what most of you in the room, most people think when they imagine corruption. We imagine an exchange of money in a dark alley. But it also can be a conflict of interest, embezzlement, nepotism, sextortion, and undue influence, among other shapes. And corruption thrives in environments of secrecy and abundance of wealth. And that's what we see in the SIPRI data this year. In the defense sector is not an exception. Especially, it's a sector that is often deemed too complex or too sensitive for national security reasons to allow that meaningful external scrutiny. So there is too much money, too much power in the hands of just a small group of people. And our paper presents some evidence, compelling evidence, that the strong relationship between defense spending and corruption risk. So to summarize the paper, spoiler, when defense budgets outpace oversight, corruption often follows. I have some presentation that I'm gonna share just very quickly. Can you see it? Sorry, you seeing it? Oh, close. Yeah. It's because I'm sorry, I'm having problems. I carry on. So what I wanted to show you is I wanted to bring a bit of light of this relationship between defense spending and corruption risk. The rise in defense spending presents a real concern. In our paper, we used the SIPRI data last year. We didn't have the new data. And our own data as per the index that we gather as the Government Defense Integrity Index to test that relationship between higher defense spending and corruption risk in the sector. And this relationship has often been assumed, but has been difficult to prove. And by combining the spending data with the evidence of corruption risk that our index shows, we demonstrate that while the increase in spending must always be accompanied with attention to corruption risk. So we always approach the issue from a defense governance lens. So we are looking at holes in the systems, really. So maybe I should take some time to introduce the Government Defense Integrity Index here, as many of you might not be familiar with. In this index, in the GDI, we measure institutional resilience to corruption by focusing on both policymaking and public sector governance in national defense institutions. So it's organized in 5 main risk areas: policymaking, political affairs, finances, personnel management, military operations, and procurement. We have a series of indicators, we scored indicators, and then they are aggregated. So it's down to 212 indicators. Countries that in our paper and our index, what we see is the countries that spend more on defense as a percentage of GDP tend to score lower in our GDI, indicating a higher vulnerability to corruption. So just checking the recent data that SIPRI just published this week, looking at the top 15 countries, the biggest increases in spending between 2021 and 2023 were in the categories C and D in our index. These are moderate to high risk to corruption. So countries that they have a system that has high risk to corruption have increased the military spending. Results from our GDI show that many defense institutions in countries around the world are very ill-equipped to manage the higher corruption risk that militarization brings. And 1/3 of the top 40 highest military spenders in the world are threatened by high to critical corruption risk in their defense sectors. Even if some high spenders may have stronger domestic controls and they're doing well in the GDI, they often export arms and security assistance to countries facing much greater corruption risk. They're exporting corruption. Even we need further evidence to evaluate causality here. There are strong indications that this relationship could go both ways. So in countries experiencing strong levels of state capture, and state capture is this systematic corruption whereby narrow interest groups, the elite, take control of the institutions and processes through which public policy is made. So elites are more likely to prioritize military spending over other forms of public spending. So to be clear, it's no one-way street. Not only does militarization lead to higher corruption risk, but in some countries where the defense sector is captured by elites, so there is a lot of corruption, there are strong incentives to raise spending and thus perpetuating the cycle of corruption. So when international insecurity rises, so does global defense spending, and the hidden cost of that escalation is the proliferation of corruption within the defense sector. When defense spending rises in countries where corruption safeguards are a priority, the issue becomes more serious. Corruption in defense and security, all those forms of corruption, nepotism, bribery, conflict of interest, undermines national security. These practices divert critical resources and erode the trust and weaken the whole country defense capabilities and stability, and the whole country governance. So we are raising military spending because we want to face a threat. And if we are doing it without the proper tools of governing the threat and the sector, we are risking perpetuating the cycle of insecurity. Different factors are behind these weaknesses in these standards. including the weak oversight of the sector, the lack of effective policy and planning, misplaced norms around defense exceptionalism, which is this idea that because of national security considerations, this sector should be exempt from good transparency norms. So when scrutiny of decisions are reduced, high influences of funds create new opportunities for corruption. And the influence of the military actors also increases. So again, we are increasing the military spending because we want to uphold national and human security. But if these issues are not properly looked after, failing to do all this will increase that insecurity. In our paper, we have, if I had some time to do a bit of a deep dive, public financial management serves as the backbone of government operations, ensuring transparency and accountability in revenue mobilization, budget allocation, spending, and auditing. And robust public financial management systems are crucial for combating corruption because they establish a clear process and regulations. Defense spending poses unique challenges because of the complexity of the sector and the scale of acquisitions, and often involves highly technical equipment. So this complexity makes it difficult for non-experts to evaluate the value for money, to highlight the needs for specialized oversight. So that really highlights the need that we need to align increments of military expenditure with a specialized oversight. So if we focus, our GDI have many indicators that could be used, but if we focus on the standards on defense budgeting and financial expenditure risk, the results of the GDI show that across these areas, countries with high levels of defense spending often have significant weaknesses in their institutional controls. And over 1/3, 35% of the top spenders are threatened by high to critical risk of corruption in financial management. And across the 86 countries that we study in the GDI, only 52% of the countries assessed published disaggregated data on actual defense spending versus budgeted spending. So, which is very important to make that distinction. Another area that is very important to look and the GDI have important data is access to information provisions. We use access to information to understand institutional exposure to financial corruption risk, and budgetary information should be readily available to access through agreed mechanisms. So any confidential information should be retained based on very transparent and agreed classification criteria. Not everything is a matter of national security. However, in 70% of the countries in the GDI index, there are regularly refusals to share requested budgetary information, and is frequently redacted. So it's simply impossible to access through existing mechanisms. So we have some very high-level recommendations on how to manage corruption risk associated with defense spending. One is transparency and an appropriate oversight of defense budgets, not only the budgets, but actual expenditure, to ensure that the public has a comprehensive picture as much as possible of spending plans. More controls to reduce risk of funds being lost to corruption as budgets are spent, and that involves involving the parliament, civilian oversight, and external audits, and integration of anti-corruption measures into arms export controls. This is to prevent exporting countries providing arms to countries which cannot demonstrate their will and capacity to manage corruption risk, and to manage that, to absorb that arms transfer. So just to close, as we were exploring the nexus between risk of corruption in the defense sector and the rapid rise of military spending today, it is vital to remember that that all-time high defense expenditure figure isn't just numbers on defense budgets. It represents a potential breeding ground for corruption that can undermine the very security it's supposed to provide. Thank you. I'm looking forward to the conversation now.
Great. Thank you so much, Ara, for your presentation. I sincerely hope that your research findings and recommendations will initiate a broader discussion at different levels, at the national, regional, international, multilateral levels, on the importance of strengthening and increasing transparency and accountability in defense budgeting processes. And your recommendations in this regard could serve as the guiding steps. So thank you so much for this. This was very much appreciated. And I think this has been a very interesting discussion. We discussed military spending risks, corruption risks, the linkages between military spending levels and once again, the risks involved in corruption. And now I would like to open the floor for Q&A. I see that there are a few questions in the Q&A box, and I think I would like to start with a question on comparing military spending with other types of spending. And I would also like to add my part to this because I have a question as well to ask to the speakers. So the question for Diego and Ara, have you compared, the first part of the question is mainly for Diego, but the second part is for Ara. So have you compared military expenditures with social expenditures, health, education, welfare, to show trends in government priorities? And I would like to complement this question with another one. So why does the defense sector and defense budgets remain the most vulnerable for corruption? Have you seen any improvements? And are you planning to look at other sectors? So I try to combine those two since we look at different sectors and different expenditures. So please, whoever wants to start, Diego perhaps, or Ara, the floor is yours.
Yeah, maybe I can start. Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, we haven't. The data work that we do, it's mostly for military spending. But we have published years ago, for instance, a paper, an insights paper comparing, let's say, welfare spending and military spending in Latin America. That was a while ago. We have published a comparison between ODA aid, official development assistance, and military spending. That was a few years ago. It's a bit more recent. So from time to time, we devote some effort to having a look at these things more specifically. But the database itself is for military spending. So unfortunately, of course, from the data set, you can have a very clear comparison between military spending and non-military spending if you have a look at military spending as a share of government expenditure. So in that sense, you can have a look at that comparison, that trade-off, but we don't. I just want to take the opportunity of the question to highlight something that often goes unnoticed in these discussions, which is this. We often are very much preoccupied with the trade-offs between military spending and other types of expenditure, right? Which is natural, and that's the first thing to think about. Which is, if you take $100, if you give $100 to the military, you're taking away from, let's say, health or education and so on, and that's a very immediate impact of military spending, of course. However, governments, they are a complex system, which means that rarely one thing that you do have only one response. And by that, I want to also invite not only a discussion, but just thinking about that when you increase military spending, there are other consequences. They're a bit more complex in that chain. We have evidence, accumulated academic, scientific evidence talking about the consequences of increasing military spending to political institutions, to democracy. We have evidence also on the consequences of military spending to inequality, to income inequality, to economic growth. So my point is that once you increase military spending, you have all of these other possible consequences that might come due to that increase that we often don't really pay attention. One of the reasons why we didn't often pay attention is that academic evidence, it's often hard to read if you're not an academic, because sometimes they're quite technical and they're just scattered across hundreds and hundreds of papers. There has been an effort from 1988 from a UN commissioned report to summarize that evidence into a report on the consequences of military spending, but the evidence that we have, it's outdated. It's from 1988. So I suppose that we need a renewed effort to kind of summarize that evidence to really show how complex the issue is, that it's not only taking away money from this pot of money to another, but there are more complex questions, more complex consequences in various areas of social life, really. Yeah.
Do you want me to address the question of why the defense sector is so vulnerable to corruption?
Yeah, I think you could, of course, answer this question.
Yes, of course. Several reasons. Maybe just to say some, is the high value contracts. So there's a lot of money in defense sector, as we've seen data, and contracts tend to be really a lot of resources, and that can drag to many years. Is the secrecy that has been the characteristics of the defense sector. Many of the issues are under that veil of secrecy for national security, and even things that they may be not that controversial remain classified, and in a way the general public agrees that it's a sensitive sector that requires different approaches. Then it's a sector with lots of political connections. Often we see the customer, the client, and the regulator being the same person. There is governments in arms transfers, for instance, or procurement. And it's also a sector that requires, the complexity is high and requires, that's a kind of a niche expertise. What it means is that there are very few people that really truly understand the sector, and we often see instances of arms manufacturers or arms military security providers advising governments doing defense strategy development, and indicating those for-profit organizations, indicating where the risk and how the risk look like. Like if you're thinking in most of the countries in the world, there is a very, very niche expertise. So those are some of the areas that why the defense sector is so prone to corruption. I would say that this other point to it, that is why it's so important that we care about defense sector corruption, and this corruption in many sectors, and corruption in many countries, but when it's corruption in the sector that has the lawful use of force, when it's corruption in the sector that whose purpose is to defend citizens when the sector fails, it fails big. So the consequences of corruption in the defense sector can be really dramatic. And we've seen that can generate the phenomenon of, for instance, of ghost soldiers that we saw in Afghanistan, or it can, or when citizens stop trusting the defense and security institutions, they can go to non-armed state groups for an alternative. So it is a sensitive sector that should be closely scrutinized. That's first.
Thank you very much, Diego and Ara, for your answers. I think we can address a few data-specific questions, and then I can ask a question for the both of you, Diego and Ara. So data-specific questions. Is the increase in military expenditure in Europe as a result of the Ukraine war impacting military expenditure trends in Africa? Diego, I guess you could try to address this question.
I'm not quite sure if I understood. I guess if I understood it correctly, is whether the war in Ukraine affected European military expenditure, and if that increase in Europe's military spending is affecting Africa's military expenditure. If not,
I understood it as well. Yeah.
Yes, the war in Ukraine, that was the major driver of increases in Europe, not only of 2022 and 3. But also we're expecting it to continue to increase because, as I said, many countries have made pledges to continue to increase their military spending. So they have their targets. Some targets are 4%, some targets are the 2%. But we expect this to continue to increase. In Europe alone, the increase was 16%, the regional increase, which is considering the size of their military spending, that's quite a lot. So yes, now if that affects Africa's military spending, we could not see any connection in that sense. So I would be inclined to say no. If there is any connections, please do let me know. But I would be inclined to say that we did not see anything of that sort. Yeah.
All right. Thank you, Diego. There are also a few questions related to data disaggregation. So perhaps you could address those. So we have a question about whether it's possible to dig into your military spending data to see how much countries spend on arms procurement versus personnel, for instance. And well, can you see other types of expenditures in the budget if, for instance, it comes to nuclear spending as well? So I'm combining a few questions in one.
Sure. Sometimes we do not systematically collect data on that disaggregation because when building a database, you need consistency, right? So you need to have comparable data points. And some countries provide disaggregation, some don't. And even that level of disaggregation is different across countries, even if they do at some level. So building a database with disaggregated military spending for the world, it's quite challenging, and it would require a lot of resources that at the moment we unfortunately do not have. But that's a long-standing project that SIPRI has to collect disaggregated. Sometimes we do find that those data points for a few countries. For instance, for the US, we do know that in relative terms, investments in research, development, and innovation are increasing. We have some anecdotal evidence on increases of, let's say, investments in conventional capabilities and procurement for China. We also have for Israel, for India, investments in domestic arms procurement and arms production. So for a few countries, we do have some disaggregation that we often mention in either our fact sheet or our yearbook. But for the data itself, we unfortunately do not have that data collected systematically.
Thank you very much, Diego, for your answer. We have a question for Ara. Ara, What are some of corruption risks with increase in defense industrial collaboration, sometimes called defense offsets? I wonder if you at Transparency International looked at this particular issue.
We just published another report looking at this specifically from the lens from the US. Corruption in defense offset can undermine efforts for the country that is in the offset to really obtain critical defensive capabilities. It can waste the funds, government funds. So what we've seen in our report, so I don't know if you are familiar with offsets, but it's this kind of a trade-off agreement, part of an arms sale that the company, that industry will be using some of the local suppliers or organizations or companies in the receiving place. And sometimes it's used in a very obscure manner to put certain requirements to the supplier company, the supplier country. There is so offset is one of the areas of it's the highest corruption risk, both in our index looking at the industry and in our index looking at the government's institutions and policies in place. So we need more regulation of offsets agreements. This is a process that in many other areas of trade is banned, but in the defense sector is still allowed. So many arms importing countries face high to very high corruption risk due to the lack of transparency of this type of investments. And it's often accompanied by very weak monitoring and enforcement around the offset contracts. So the corruption risks are really high, and it should be a priority for those working on arms trade and defense expenditure.
Thank you, Ara, for addressing this question. I can see that we have a few region-specific and country-specific questions, and I would like to ask Diego. Diego, would you like to address these questions now, or would you encourage the attendees to reach out to you directly and discuss those questions with you?
I mean, you choose. I don't know how much time we have left. I can address them maybe a couple now, or yeah, you choose.
All right. I think perhaps we could address a few questions, and then because we have 5 minutes left, so there is not so much time to discuss those interesting questions. But one of the questions we have is, do you have an idea about the amount of military spending in Ukraine since the beginning of the war from the Western Russian sides as well? Also, with regards to Israel, what is the volume of Israeli and American military spending since October? So those are quite specific time frames. And another question about the recent US decision to support Ukraine with military aid, $61 billion, how this might affect the course of the war. Thank you very much. It would be great if you could address just some parts of the questions.
Sure, I'll try to reply briefly. So the military aid to Ukraine, we do have numbers for that. We have, for instance, for the US, this number is also in our fact sheet. In 2023, 3.9% of the US military spending was the military aid to Ukraine. We also have numbers for Israel, but this is not in the fact sheet as far as I remember. But it was around $3 billion, if I'm not mistaken now. But we do have some of these numbers in the fact sheet if you want to consult, and of course they are all accounted. for. About the military aid to Ukraine and how that will impact the war, that is, I don't really know. That will depend on a large number of factors, how this is used, how the speed. There's so many factors in that this is the effectiveness of military aid. It's something hard to measure, something hard to evaluate qualitatively even. So I'll not try to anticipate any of the outcomes on that. The other question was about what? I'm sorry, Alexandra. I forgot now. Alexandra?
Yeah, sorry, I was trying to unmute
Oh, that's
myself. Military aid, but this is something you.
Yeah.
Yeah, we discussed Ukraine, military aid by the U.S., Israel. Well,
Yeah.
I think
Oh, I think there was a question about the effect of the war for Israel's Israeli military spending. So in our numbers, we also give that there was quite Israel provides monthly data for military spending, and we can see that the line, it's relatively flat up until October, of course, and then it shoots up where I can see really the effect of the war, and the difference between the initial budget put forward for Israel and the executed budget was 21%. So you can see the difference there and the clear effect of the war in Israel's military spending. Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Diego, for addressing these questions. I can see that the questions are quite diverse, so thank you very much for being flexible with your answers, Diego and Ara. Now we have 2 minutes left, and I would like to ask you the last question to the both of you, and my apologies for the attendees if we haven't addressed your questions. Please reach out to the panelists to get answers. But the last question I would like to ask is, how can the work done by SIPRI and Transparency International, and perhaps UNIDIR even, contribute to the disarmament machinery? Contribute towards the call within the new agenda for peace towards reduction in military spending and in human-centered security? I think this is a good question to for concluding our panel discussion. Diego, Ara, would you like?
Okay. Yeah, I think the work that SIPRI does, providing the numbers, I think that's very useful. So these numbers are used a lot, but I think that to have a bigger effect, we need to do more and really engage. I mean, we know the numbers are appalling and that they are really high. It's 2.4 trillion. But I mean, I suppose that to really have some sort of change, will need to be even more convincing about the consequences of that number. It's not, as I said, it's not only taking away money from other pots of money, but there are many political, social, and economic consequences of increasing. Not only that, they may even further contribute to insecurity in some cases. So I think we need to be more clear about the consequences of that and really have a clear understanding with what are the entry points for change. I guess one thing that we can do is really engage more with member states ahead of the first committee discussions for the General Assembly. That's exactly where these issues are discussed, and our numbers often come up in the discussions. But to make the argument and the narrative stronger, maybe engaging with them and providing that accumulated evidence that we have on the consequences of military spending to really brief them and empower them in their message. Engage with national parliaments, with budget commissions, because they're the ones deciding how much money is going to the military. So if we inform them about the consequences of military spending, they will take that into account when they are deciding to approve an allocation coming from one budget to military spending. And often, because they are caught up in many other parts of their job, they don't have the time really to consider those consequences. So engaging with them, and also with civil society organizations as well, because they are the one also pushing forward those issues. And really, the number of that's one impression, right? That's my impression. The number of civil society organizations that really consider military spending I think is still low. And I think one job that we can do is really convince them and then clarify the importance of that issue to whatever they are concerned about, because it's certainly related to a certain extent. So I guess those 3 entry points are something that we really need to consider seriously.
Excellent. Thank you, Diego. And Ara, same question to you.
Thank you. This is a very interesting question. I would like to hear what Unity has to say. So corruption in the defense sector, as I said, can cause incredible harm in development. It can perpetuate conflict. It can perpetuate inequalities, exacerbate gender-related violence. But also corruption in the sector, it can also prevent the tools that we're putting in place to address conflict, address crisis. It can prevent that those tools succeed. So we often, our role is to raise awareness of the role of corruption in conflict and nexus as not only a consequence of conflict, but often a root cause. We're calling for a holistic approach to these issues and to the wicked problems that we have ahead, peace building, and corruption has often been put to the side. It's like an issue that it can happen. We'll deal with it when we have stability, when we have when it's a better time, and that time never comes, because corruption is really preventing that the tools that we have in hand work properly. So we are also calling for the international community and civil society organization to look at the corruption issue and go how the different areas of the work, like SIPRI, the military spending, what is the impact with corruption? What does it mean to have increased such a sharp rise military spending for the systems that we have for many years? Agree that they are the good systems that are gonna provide governance of good governance of the sector. So we're calling for the international community to come to the wicked problems we have ahead in a holistic manner and not leave some areas for later, and to work with us, address the issues and give the importance that it deserves.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ara, for your response. That was insightful and thought-provoking as well. On our side, I think that we're doing everything we can, but of course, one of the issues we would like to look at is, for instance, to see what kind of security dimensions states prioritize, whether it's military-related security or non-military-related security, and how the resources are being allocated to support these priorities or tackle security threats. So there is a project we're trying to do together with SIPRI actually on exploring the ways to assess the extent to which the allocation of public resources match the national prioritization of security threats. So hopefully we will succeed with it. But on my side, I would like to say that we just need to collaborate, communicate, and exchange data, and have more webinars like this when we can discuss data risks, implications. Yeah, I think this would be the comment on my side. So I would like to thank you, Diego, Ara, for your excellent presentations and also for your work. This conversation was incredibly useful, thought-provoking, interesting to me and to the attendees. And I would also like to thank the audience for your interest in the subject and also for staying with us a bit over time and attending the webinar, of course. So on this note, I wish you a great reminder of the day. And I'm just saying, well, see you next time. Thank you so much, everyone.